Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Textual Awakening podcast. In each episode, we try to delve deeply into the most profound books and ideas of our time in order to gain wisdom and live a more fulfilling life. My name is Jake Taylor, and I will be your host. Today, I want to pick up where I left off in discussing some key differences between Marxism and the Mormon conception of Zion, the perfected Christian society. Both are utopian projects with some similar features, but I am convinced that the adage I've heard all my life as a Mormon, which is that the law of consecration is just perfected gospel-centered communism, is not simply incorrect, but a paradox in terms, two irreconcilable ideologies that do not mesh. They are oil and water. I also want to bring contemporary neuroscience into the discussion of the ideal life, which is ultimately what utopian ideologies of all stripes ostensibly strive for. I'll be referring to the book The Master and His Emissary by Dr. Iain McGilchrist, a book which I very briefly summarized in a prior podcast episode. Here is a link to that video if you're interested in watching that summary. And it is a book that I would encourage anyone and everyone to read. Just know in advance, it is quite dense. So, as a quick reminder of some caveats that I laid out last episode, I am an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I do not speak for the church writ large. I have a degree in genetics, and I have a moderate layperson's understanding of neurophysiology, psychology, and theology, but I do not claim to be an expert in any of these fields. Critiques are welcome in the comment section, but I would only ask that they focus primarily on the ideas that I'm wrestling with and do not become rude or contentious. So, one of the fundamental ways in which Marxism veers away from Zion is reflected in this quote attributed to young Karl Marx himself. Man is man's own God. This phrase can be interpreted in myriad ways, but a fairly standard interpretation that I have come across of this sentiment is as follows. The subjective desires, aspirations, and worldview of any given person should guide and direct that person to the ultimate degree. There is no universal moral ethic, and there is no all-knowing deity. For Marxists, this admission of a godless reality is transcendent because it places man as the god of his own subjective universe. The process of integrating one's own subjective vision into physical reality is the central aim of Marxism, fundamentally. This process is called praxis, in which theory and practice unite, which includes the revolutionary aspects of Marxism as a means to liberate the collective from all forms of exploitation and oppression. Only in a liberated communist society, where each man and woman's physical needs are taken care of by the collective, for the collective, can each individual have full, unadulterated access to the full range of their subjective life experience and bring that vision into being. So there are nuggets of truth in this sentiment, which I think many people would agree with. In reference to my own church's doctrine, we believe that each man and woman indeed has unique abilities, interests, and personality traits. It is the lifelong quest of integrating these various aspects of ourselves with ever higher goals and values that forms a large portion of each person's path towards the divine. The musician honing their technique, the carpenter seeking more efficient uses of time and resources, the teacher engaging with their students in an increasingly more dynamic and engaging way, these are all examples of subjective experiences that at first only exist as ideas and desires in the mind of individual people. But by bringing these subjective visions into the real world, it is a good thing and a necessary thing for personal development. That being said, just because human beings have the ability to consciously imagine new concepts before they are enacted or created in the physical world, it does not mean that there is no divine aspect of reality outside of the human mind. Just pragmatically speaking, what does a Marxist do when someone's subjective vision comes in conflict with another person's or with their own? Whose subjective reality wins out? Or what happens when someone's subjectivity comes in direct conflict with reality itself and cannot be made physical or enacted in the world? These rhetorical questions may seem pedantic if you lean left politically, but to me they're an unyielding set of stumbling blocks upon which contemporary leftism just is continually breaking both itself and contemporary Western society. So another question worth asking is, what is the ultimate aim of the process Marx called praxis? To whom does the individual serve or become in making their subjective vision real? For Marx, the answer was man himself is the person served. Man is his own God, so man should worship man, to restate the quote. For the Latter-day Saint, along with Christians more broadly, the ultimate ideal is not simply one's own subjective vision, but the ideal of Jesus Christ himself and the life that he lived. Marx preached liberation from any one concrete ideal, while the gospel of Jesus Christ largely preaches assimilation to the one true ideal, which is God. For a Marxist, not only is belief in God pure superstition, but religion as a concept, for Marx, was developed over time as a means of exploitation. Religious institutions serve the ruling class by sedating the working class rank and file to remain docile. Deference to authority, guilt for social deviance, postponement of judgment and justice until after death. All of these religious dogmas, to Marx, are all suppression tactics created by the ruling class over a long period of time. It is in this spirit that Marx called religion the opiate of the masses, not because all spirituality was to be disdained, but because codified religious dogma will inevitably sedate the revolutionary spirit of the working class through traditional roles and morals. So for a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as well again as for many other Christian denominations, the institution of the church cannot be separated from the process of becoming a Zion person and people. Ritual ordinances like baptism and the weekly sacrament have no significance or authority outside of the singular religious institution. Codified religious laws and rites, while inevitably suppressive to individual subjective freedom, provide necessary barriers and restraints against the inevitable competition between different people's conception of what is right and wrong. Religious rules also provide the necessary barriers to test our individual humility, our willingness to subject ourselves before God and His will. There is always a balance to be struck, and God certainly gave us our own free will for us to exercise it and not defer all decisions to Him or to our religious leaders. That being said, there will without exception arise points in each faithful Christian's life where the ideal life which Christ embodied and that person's own desires and imagination will come in conflict one with another. That is simply a reflection on the imperfect condition of mortal existence. We all fall short of the grace of God, and it is at these barriers that our humility is necessarily tested, and those tests of humility are built right into the messy, political, familial nature of a bounded religious institution. We need the church just as much as the church needs us. The Christian mantle to take up one's cross and follow Jesus Christ is a metaphorical command to undergo something related to the Marxist concept of praxis. Each committed Christian is duty-bound to themselves and to God to follow the positive desires and abilities given to all of us. Think about the parable of the talents. But if our subjective will is contrary to the will of God, we are asked to sacrifice that aspiration. For Marx, as a materialist atheist, there is no such thing as a sacrifice to God because God does not exist. Again, there is no transcendent moral ethic for Marx, nor are there quote-unquote higher values outside of an individual's subjective will and their vision for their life. This view that there is no hierarchy of latent value in the world itself, and that man as a conscious being is his own God in a manipulatable world, betrays a particular view of the world and man's place in it. This worldview is characteristic of the left cerebral hemisphere. This stance originates from the book The Master and His Emissary by Dr. Iain McGilchrist, which again I encourage everyone to read. Dr. McGilchrist describes the left hemisphere of the brain as fundamentally self-referential. So instead of dealing directly with the outside world as it is, the left hemisphere interprets incoming information by comparing it to its own preconceptions, abstracting the thing observed from its context in order to represent it as a concrete, bounded entity that can then be dissected and manipulated. The left hemisphere is simultaneously focused on the utility of whatever it observes and on proving the correctness of its preconceived notion of what the thing observed should be like. This can and does lead to a circular worldview, where the left hemisphere only sees in the world what it wants to see. This worldview is naturally balanced by the context-centric, holistic, embodied right hemisphere of the brain. But due to the left hemisphere's competitive nature and strong internal will, it tends to push the relationship between the two out of balance. The thought that man can define his own system of values and morals is a Promethean idea, a Luciferian project, if ever there was one. It assumes that people can know exactly what is best for them in a conscious, explicit manner. It might seem like I'm taking a Platonic view on human beings, that people cannot conceptualize what is best for them, so they need to be told what to do by a philosopher king. That's not what I'm saying. The point that I'm trying to make is a little more elusive than that, which is largely why religious language is simply so useful when describing ideas associated with the right hemisphere. Essentially, it comes down to humility before God as the ultimate ideal way of being, and a respect for the whisperings of the Holy Ghost, rather than trusting in rational constructs that do not account for unintended consequences or the infinite complexity of the external world. God is at the very least a necessary metaphor for the embodied wisdom collected through human evolutionary history. While I personally believe God does exist in a corporeal, objective sense, having this concept of God as a metaphor is not just useful, but I think 100% necessary representation of what is valuable in life, and it provides a good backstop for when trials of faith put questioning God into the forefront of my mind. And I think it could help other people who are having a trial of faith. At the very least, God is a necessary metaphor of the ideal value hierarchy in the universe, which there is one, external to human manipulation and desire. That's something that Iain McGilchrist talks about, and maybe I'll talk about it someday, but it takes a little bit of time, and it's kind of a slippery topic. So, bringing it back to an aside, this hubristic rejection of humility before the infinite complexity of the universe forms a large part of what I think is fundamentally incorrect behind a lot of different philosophers' writings. This includes Marx, but also Ayn Rand, Friedrich Nietzsche, postmodernists like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, modern atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, as well as many other people throughout history. Many of these writers will get their own series in the future. But, back to Marxism. It is apparent when studying Marx's social critiques that he understood much of what ails the modern industrial worker. I think many of his critiques actually hold up better now in contemporary society than they did during the Industrial Revolution, particularly his concept of alienation in an information economy. However, Marxism is a left hemisphere dominant approach to solve fundamentally right hemisphere associated problems, specifically those of meaning, spirituality, fulfillment, and community. Marx tragically employed left hemisphere methods of understanding to form his solutions to fight for individual meaning and autonomy, resulting in perverted versions of the very thing he was trying to dismantle, which inextricably Marxism has resulted in oppressive states of orthodoxy, dogma, and mass privation. As much as leftists try to disregard this argument, it is simply an objective fact in history that every nation-state which put Marxism fully into practice developed into a highly dogmatic machine for human degradation and ultimately death. Now, Marx is a complex historical figure. On one hand, I find myself agreeing with a lot of his arguments against the status quo. He had a context-rich understanding of what a human being needs to feel satisfied with their life, or at the very least, he definitely understood what naturally creative people crave in their pursuit to push the boundaries of experience. Like I said in the last episode, Marxism never would have caught on like it has through history if it did not contain some fundamentally serious truths that grip people at a basal level. To me, it is Marx's cynicism that corrupted his powerful insights about human potential. His outright rejection of the mentoring capacity of political and religious institutions in order to focus exclusively on the oppressive aspects of power dynamics, I think blinded him to the necessity of humility in the face of a complex world that cannot be fundamentally understood consciously. Again, see the Master and His Emissary for insight about what I just said. There is this connection between left hemisphere rejection of context / the outside world and the Marxist obsession with subjectivity and creating the ideal world through social revolution. Liberate me from constraints, says the Marxist, all while misunderstanding that most constraints and rules are by and large not arbitrary. There exists a world outside the left hemisphere, the world which the right hemisphere engages with directly, and it cannot be fully understood nor engaged with in concrete, explicit terms. The Marxist focus on the subjective and the objective is misguided. I think it's simply two sides of the same left hemisphere coin. It skirts around the core issue of epistemology, or how knowledge is created. That which is true can be apprehended or created at all with any finality. This is not correct. As much as it's difficult, even for me as a scientist, it's hard to accept that knowledge cannot be final, but truth is a process, which the Mormon doctrine in particular is willing to accept better than I think a lot of religions do, especially outside of the East. So the Mormon church culture, like many religious cultures, tends to focus more on the concrete truth claims provided by our theology rather than the incomplete nature of our understanding. We say and hear things like, the church is true, and the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, said quite often in church services and in speeches given to us by church officials. As an active member of the Mormon Church, my goal is definitely not to reject these statements. I accept them, and I personally do believe the Book of Mormon was translated by Joseph Smith through the power of God. I personally don't see how any other way you could describe it, because it's unbelievably deep as a text, and it has absolutely bizarre circumstances how it came into being. It was produced very rapidly by a completely uneducated person and a school teacher who, by his own account, just wrote it down. He just wrote down when Joseph dictated to him, freehand. So it's a very strange book, but it's a very deep book. Put that aside, I do want to convey that what I do want to convey is that as members of the church, we are not immune to the left hemisphere push against what makes religion so special and necessary in the first place. Statements like, we cannot know all of the God's mysteries in this life, or revelation as a process is never fully complete, are more ambiguous and less compelling by nature than saying, I know the gospel is true. But they are necessary attitudes to integrate if we have any hope of becoming a Zion people. After all, humility is not self-deprecation. It is deference to God in our mortal weakness. Deference is not bondage. Deference should not result in inaction or weakness of conviction. Deference is a willingness to show respect for God and all that He represents, which includes fighting pride and hubris within ourselves and within our communities, our sphere of influence. This is essentially the faithful life, a life lived with faith. And this is my own personal take, and although it's not a concrete fact, I have a hunch that many people will agree with me there. So we fall short of Zion in many ways as members of the LDS Church. Consecration was tried and failed many times during the early decades of the Church. Didn't fail every time, but eventually it failed enough times that it was just scrapped for now. So we're not expected to live with all things in common anymore, but there are things we can do to make progress in the journey towards Zion during our individual lifetimes. There is a rampant materialism that has taken hold of many Mormon communities. This is obviously not unique to the Mormon Church, but it does go against our doctrine that love of money is the root of all evil. Marx's insight about the loss of self in the explicit pursuit of money above all else, I think, is fundamentally correct. We run a great risk by coupling power and respect within the church to a person's ability to acquire wealth. The Book of Mormon is not kind to people who seek after money and power instead of putting their gospel values into practice. Remember what happens to the Nephites when they place value on the richness of their clothes and appearances instead of using their abundance to enrich the lives of others. There is a balance that needs to be found, just like with everything else, and our church does not ascribe to asceticism as a necessary path to salvation. We need to remember to integrate the left hemisphere values of competition and the accrual of resources, which are necessary, with the right hemisphere values of community building, personal development, and a sense of what is most valuable in life. And a remembrance of our mortality. We get one shot. Do we serve God or mammon in this life? Self-sufficiency is a virtue, but it can easily turn into a vice. We as a church also need to find a balance between explicit truth claims as a necessary aspect of our missionary effort as we try to persuade people of the value contained in our way of life, and integrating it with an acceptance that we do not know and cannot know all that is true in this life. Truth is a process, and we as a church should be the first to recognize that all truth will be circumscribed into one great whole, regardless of the source. Wisdom, in contrast with information, can only serve its function when acted upon. God, as the ultimate embodiment of wisdom, fulfills the role of arbiter when judgments clash. Morals are indeed relative to a given context, but they are not arbitrary in the sense that anything goes. Moral judgments are always relative to the standards and principles set by God, not to rational constructs created by other men or women, no matter how smart they may be. Hopefully today I was able to shed a bit more light on exactly how and why Marxism is at its core not akin to the law of consecration. Hopefully I was able to demonstrate a few ways in which we can learn from political philosophies like Marx, which are critical of some of the pitfalls that strike religious institutions, as well as any large institution of people. But bringing it back to Marxism and law of consecration, their foundations are not the same. Their methods are not the same. Their objectives are not the same. And just because some key aspects of their envisioned utopias are similar, i.e. the elimination of class and poverty, that does not mean Zion and communism are cut from the same cloth, because they are not. I believe that books like The Master and His Emissary provide compelling insight as to exactly what those distinctions are that separate the two. The problems Marx was wrestling with during his life cannot be solved through the conscious will of the intellect. The problems of elitism, oppressive use of power, and poverty will only reconcile themselves when each individual person in a gospel-centered community takes the duty upon themselves to bear their own cross and to follow Christ. Marx's cynicism and hubris were his downfall, like so many other brilliant men and women before him. But don't take my word for it. Engage with the best books and ideas for yourself. I'll leave some of the articles that I read as links down in the description for your reading pleasure. Once again, thanks for joining the Textual Awakening. Consider subscribing and leaving a comment below with your thoughts. I have been your host. My name is Jake Taylor, and I will see you next time. Take care.